Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young, and I'm doing a series of videos related to different policy. This particular video's focus is going to be on green technology, and it's going to go beyond just the government policies, but I'll talk briefly about climate change. Now, I'm coming from a perspective of a finance person with some understanding of the sciences as well to kind of go through the rhetoric of stuff like that. I'm not a person that denies climate change isn't an issue, but what I am against is the fear mongering done by the left in terms of climate change. So I want to come at this as more of a sustainable effort in terms of looking at policies to both support the brick and mortar side of the Canadian economy as well as expand into green technology as part of diversifying the economy. So basically I'll discuss trends, I'll discuss mining raw material trade agreements, I'll discuss current funding or cost factors related to climate change, I'll discuss the NDP and Liberal policies, and I'll go into export and other strategy. So let's talk about focus. This particular graph is based from the Clean Tech organization. If you look at basically the bulk of what you're seeing in green technology is if you go out in southwestern Ontario or any other provinces, you're going to see solar panels, you're going to see wind. Those are the big focus of many governments. And their political statements, because a lot of governments are trying to move away from fossil fuels, whether that's coal, diesel, or other options, as part of expanding into that. Now, my presentation will not touch base on nuclear in general. The reason why that is because I want to focus on the growing technology because in green energy across multiple areas of platform. I won't also talk about hydro because in general I will provide a slide that actually shows you power generation, the bulk of power generation is between hydro and nuclear. So if you want to talk about things, and this is a good slide here, quickly, the NDP and Liberal are great at this whole message that Stephen Harper is nasty to the environment, or Harper doesn't care about clean technology. What they're not accurate about is the true ranking. Canada can rank in any type of innovation index anywhere between number 7 and number 11 to top 12. So they're within the top 20 constantly. They've been there for many years. This all started when the Liberal government was in power under Paul Martin. They introduced a group, a company or entity called the Sustainable Development Technology Organization, which was to provide bridge financing for startups in green technology like wind, solar, or other things from water treatment. So that started it, and also different provinces have made different commitments in terms of development, but either by their own legislation, like in case of Ontario, they brought in the Water Act, Clean Water Act, which helped bring in new companies that are looking at membrane technology as part of the filtration system of water. But again, the key aspect I want to drive here is that Harper is leveraging existing programs and expanded into new areas to support next generation of jobs and job creation. But that's not the message you'll hear from the opposition. So why clean technology? Why? Well, everything else, this earth is only so big. We've got so many pressures from greenhouse gases, GHG, or other things in terms of managing environmental standards, whether we want to make sure that the land is better utilized in terms of fertilization and just the whole overall supply chain in terms of utilizing land and water supply. So the whole idea of clean technology is to look at different options to basically expand in areas to help transform the economy. Now in Canada's case, it's about $25 billion business in Canada, green technology, with about 80% of that going as exports. So we do got a green technology economy here. It already exists. You'll never hear that from Mulcair talking about that because, again, he panders for votes. He doesn't pander with facts. So this basically tells you that that's basically it exists. The other thing that he doesn't tell you that it's growing at a growth rate of 8 to 10% a year. But the biggest issue with it, just like when we talk about small business or other business, is access to capital, access to resources to kind of take an idea from incubation to market. So part of that is all issues in terms of policy. Is there more the government of Canada can do? Yes, there is, but there also has to be an integrated strategy where the provinces leverage federal programs and work together with the federal government to come to an integrated strategy. And that comes into play from both the interprovincial trade barriers as well as looking at research hubs. We've seen a lot of cases with technology that we've got some research hubs, whether they're at Queen's University, Western, Waterloo, to kind of move technology forward. So let's talk about the global market here. This basically shows that we are losing share, but that's not something that cannot be fixed. It just needs to be reinvigorated in terms of policies and more of an integrated strategy to this. That's not what you're going to hear from the Liberals. Justin Trudeau actually come out and said that Harper's failing on green technologies. Not, but more is required. He could have said that. His commitment is he wants to expand more money in clean technology, but the money is peanuts to what's required. It needs to be an integrated strategy in terms of research hubs to see how we can leverage innovation from startups to mid-sized to large-sized companies. But you'll never get that from Justin Trudeau. Why? Because the guy doesn't have a business background. He's more about whatever they plant a seed into Trudeau's brain, he will speak out about. He will never discuss details because he's not capable of going into specific details of things other than going in platitudes and keywords and buzzwords to try to get people to think he knows what he's talking about. SDTC is a government program that was established by Goodale. I won't go into much specifics because I've already talked about it, but the goal of it is to provide seed funding. This shows you the time frame in terms of what's happening in terms of the number of deals completed in the portfolio since its inception. You'll see 119 deals have done. Now, it came in about 10 years ago, so they're doing about maybe 10 to 15 deals a year, so it's helping it. It's also providing significant benefits to the economy in terms of as we transform. So we went from virtually a very low in green technology to a vibrant $25 billion thing. So it's about 1.5% of GDP is tied to green technology. Now, this is the thing that you do not hear about. Okay, in order to truly grow green technology, you rely on multitude of things. You rely on specific minerals. Now, you never hear this talked about from the Liberal government and the NDP. Why? Because they're not concerned about the details. But I'm going to give you the details here. In order to do solar, wind, other technology, you need what we call as raw materials. Those raw materials are lithium, that's usually the batteries. And that's what you're seeing there with lithium and vanadium, they're the batteries. Rare metals go in at all aspects of wind turbines to solar panels. Now, in essence, is without these raw materials, you don't have green technology. Now, why did I put the mining rankings up there? Canada has significant resources in lithium, vanadium, graphene starting to grow here as well. We're not world leaders yet because we're still in the exploratory stages to look at the reserves here. But Canada could become a world leader in raw materials, especially rare metals. And because currently with rare metals is China controls the bulk of that. And this comes back to trade deals. The Mulcair government is very good at talking about Harper gets it wrong on trade deals. Yet, in order to grow green technology, you need to have significant trade or investment deals with countries that have those minerals that allow you to fabricate and produce the green technology in your country. You need access to those materials, and you only get that through investment in trade deals. Yet, you never hear a coherent strategy either from the Liberal governments or the NDP. I put this particular graph up here is that Ontario, for example, that has significant resources in lithium and potentially other areas that would support green technology, has fallen behind in terms of its ability to bring projects to market. And that's been driven by poor policy decisions made by Wynne and McGuinty government, which impact green technology. But you'll never hear that because resource management is governed by the provinces. What you will hear from Mulcair is he will dictate policies in terms of mining practices and all that and force it down on the governments in the provincial level. Mining extraction accounts for 8% of GDP in Canada. If we don't have mining extractions and we make it more difficult, then we're going to be limiting our exposure for foreign direct investment, which will impact corporate taxes, income taxes, and all that. But you're not going to hear those statements. And the reason I want to bring it out is because it's very important to understand it. Now, I just brought up the lithium here just to show you the major producers in lithium. Canada's not ranked there yet, but there are key areas of development happening in Quebec, Ontario, and Northwest Territory related to lithium. Graphene, I'm just showing you as well. Canada's starting to grow there. The production's very low, but it's still going to end up being developed more. And I got operations here, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick will be impacted by graphene. This kind of gives you some examples of rare metals. Canada's looking at some development in the northwest area of the Ring of Fire zone, as well as the Northwest Territories near Hay River. Avalon Metals, Rare Metals, is a company you may want to check out. It'll provide you some guidance in terms of their holdings, in terms of the deposits that they're looking at to develop. And there's a big rare earth find up in the Northwest Territories. But guess what you don't hear? You don't hear about that, because you know why? The NDP's never been big on resource extraction. They rather keep things in the ground. But they would be okay with importing stuff in. So you need to ask yourself, what government is actually going to support all aspects of the economy, including development of resources that will support green technology? And I put issues about rare metals because China controls the supply here. If they're controlling the supply, that's going to impact pricing and availability of product. Vanadium just showed here as well. Again, vanadium, Quebec's basically one of the world leaders at becoming a vanadium. And the reason why I list vanadium batteries eventually have better storage capacity in charge states versus what you get with lithium. That's the reason why I've got vanadium listed. I show trade and investment agreements because the key countries in here like China, Argentina, Portugal, Brazil, and all that are key players. In South Africa, I should say as well, are key players in the raw materials related to green technology. Now, I've already talked about this. The NDP is not, or the Liberal hasn't come clean under export agreements and trade agreements that will drive the availability or access to raw materials related to that. Breaking out it into segments here, which is wind, solar, energy, water treatment, advanced materials, smart grid, recycling, ag and forestry, transportation, and all that. Now this is a chart I want to kind of spend a minute on here now. It shows you that between nuclear and hydro, there are about 44 megawatts, a kilowatt, no, a power generation in Canada. That's 80% of the power comes from those areas. Look at green, solar, and all that. They're very expensive to operate, and same with wind. Either it produces or it doesn't produce, right? It's not something you do, and if you overproduce it, you got to get rid of it. And since hydro generation falls under a provincial jurisdiction, just like resource management, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what the mandate will be from the NDP government. Again, likely what they will do, and again, they're not clear on this, they'll set federal policies and dictate to the provinces in terms of how things will do. And that's where cap and trade will come in, or more stringent regulations on that, which means they'll create more bureaucracy around basically the processes just to appease their activists, green energy people. And we'll see more and more time delays that investments will take to get them come to market. But you will not hear those statements from the NDP. Why? Because they're pandering for votes. The same with the Liberals, right? Install wind capacity in Canada. This gives you an example where we are right now. The bulk of the wind capacity is in Ontario. You also have other provinces that are picking up too, as well as Quebec. So between Quebec and Ontario, that's the bulk of the wind. And it kind of makes sense because these are the two provinces between Couillard and Wynne that are promoting green energy policies. But what Wynne's not talking about is a failure of fit in Ontario. And if Mulcair tries to use that model across Canada, what's going to happen is hydro rates and everything else, and the cost to consumers will go through the roof. It's pretty clear that when you deal with socialistic type of governments, they're not concerned about the cost, but they're good at pandering for votes. So that's why I wanted to bring this up here. This kind of shows you the cost in terms of the flow from factory gate equipment to on-site to the project being up and running. Now, here's the key thing to bear in mind with wind and solar is if you don't have sufficient enough power, you have to build backup generation. Typically with backup generation, it's usually natural gas plants, and that's what you're hearing being built in areas like Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, to kind of put up backup systems for green energy. This shows you the kind of the wind cost breakdown in terms of the rotor blades, the tower, and all that. So guess what towers are made of? Steel. Guess what blades are made of? Steel. There's wiring in that. That's copper wiring. Okay? So, green energy itself doesn't exist in its own right. It's not let you shake a little bit of pixie dust together and you create it. You have to create it from raw materials to fabricate it, to deliver it, and install. That being said, it's not green technology till it produces power. And that's the misnomer that you're going to hear from, whether it's wind or solar, because they require raw material. That raw material has to be mined, extracted, and fabricated. And yet, you don't hear that question on that. You don't. Why? Because they can't sell that. They can sell to their activists that they're pushing projects, but they won't ever tell you that it's not really true green energy. Solar, again, this shows you the history of solar since 1996 in terms of capacity. You'll see that we're now posting well over 2,000 megawatts of power. This talks about solar process in terms of silicon wafer cell production modular. It shows you the basically smart grid now. This is more kind of utilizing power to kind of shift power loads around. That's what smart grid's about. Water treatment, this is the key area, and the reason I bring this up, this is where Ontario is one of the world leaders in that, in its membrane technology. This is an area too that links back to the First Nations, that maybe through some membrane systems and on-site water treatment systems we can bring more clean water to First Nations, but you won't hear that about that from the governments, not from the governments, from the Liberal or the NDP parties, because they're not interested in those solutions or getting that information out, but they're very good at pandering for votes. This just talks about global advanced batteries. Again, that's part of the old energy storage where we're looking at lithium. Technology is changing and it's evolving. It's not like wind and solar haven't been around. They've been around for decades. It's more that we've got the capability, the capacity to more absorb photons, whether it's indirect or direct, and we have more capacity to store that power. This shows you basically what's happening in advanced materials. This is where we start getting graphene, lightweight materials, as part of fabrication, whether it gets into cars, gets into different aspects of the supply chain management. This is what this is talking about. And this talks about lightweight materials like titanium, magnesium, and aluminum. It's talking about composites like caviar, carbon. It's basically talking about that. If you look at aluminum, titanium, magnesium, Canada at some point has reserves in those areas or has to import those materials in. Again, you won't hear the Liberal government or the NDP government talk about this area. This basically talks about what's happening in terms of startup companies that were fed in from the STD, from the Sustainable Development Corporation. Green energy and forestry. Well, again, what's happening in here, there's been more and more sustainable practices to ensure that we cut trees down but make it sustainable. We're also looking at the way we treat the pulp residual from the pulp and paper process or the lumber process in terms of things. In many cases now the forestry mills are running what they call as biomass plants to kind of support their power generation, but using waste wood to kind of generate those processes, and they're also looking at better ways to treat water and all that. So that's the reason why I bring that up. And same with agricultural processes. We're getting in more into expert farming, looking at less and less of fertilization and more better practices to kind of control that overflow. And that's really what that's doing. This talks about more transportation, and we're seeing more and more light rail systems and that come in. Recycling, we've seen that more and more as well come into play, where we're recycling plastics, breaking down those things. Less and less is going into landfill. Clean air, we're doing more and more in terms of the scrubbing technologies. It's light years ahead of where we were in the 70s. That's another area that you need to be concerned about that we moved for. Now let's talk quickly about climate change. Now, you're going to hear different people spill their things in. The issue with climate change is you can put 20 experts in a room and get 20 different answers. Do we need to do things like climate change? Yes, we do, but we need to do it in the most productive and efficient way to keep everything involved and not hurt the economy. It seems to me that the Liberal government and the NDP are more about pushing green energy policies, whether that's the Agenda 21 by the UN, than they are looking about supporting all aspects of the economy. As I mentioned earlier, with green technology, it's about a $25 billion business growing at 8 to 10% per annum. The thing is you cannot remove a good chunk of the GDP without having to replace that with green technology or other new businesses. You're going to hear a lot of rhetoric from the NDP talking about they'll support next generation of business, and that's what you'll hear with the automotive funds or aerospace or food processing, right? What you're not going to hear is we are still a carbon-based society, and you can't go from a carbon-based society in year one to nothing in year two. It takes subtle changes in terms of balanced policies, which include looking at metal fabrication side, looking at advanced materials that we can change in terms of the supply chains to support it. You also have to get buy-in from the private sector, and that's the automotive to the oil producers as part of the solution. But you're not going to hear that comment from the NDP, because why? Because they're pandering for that green vote, that activist vote that's built on their party lines, and they'll tell you about. The other thing too is I would encourage you to go read some videos and watch some videos on this. One of the good ones that's talked about it is the former Greenpeace director who calls out green technology, and I'm going to make a quick point on what that really means. Is a lot of cases now to get government money, and especially the precious money that's available with government, is you need to be a doomsayer. So part of the reason why some of these companies get money is they're able to sell green technology. Obama has pushed it because he's being driven by the Tides Foundation. The Tides Foundation is created from the Rockefeller. They are pushing climate change as a complete disaster to push their own agenda policies to get government money. Now, it's not to say climate change doesn't exist, but we need to be very careful that we're not overblowing everything, that we have the right mix of policies. And despite what people say, Harper hasn't been against the climate. What he's been doing is having the right balance, just like Australia, to ensure that we have sustainable practices. You're never going to hear that because the NDP can't run, or the Liberal government can't run. Both parties can't run on what Harper has done in different areas of policy. Why? Because they'll never win the election. What they have to do is put this fear and smear into people voting, so they'll vote on emotion. This just kind of shows you the fastest growing companies. It kind of looks at different areas in terms of all that. All these are supported by different areas of seed funding. Some of it's come from SDC. That's why I basically listed it here, because this kind of shows you about different companies. And I would encourage you to go look at the top innovation companies to look at things. And this is a good slide here because it tells you about where the fastest growing companies are. You look at technology, manufacturing, industrial service, IT, telecommunications. So I would go out and look at those things, because these things will tell you these are the next generation of companies. Now, small companies are being targeted by the NDP in terms of cuts. So anything below typically 100 employees is usually deemed small. On this list, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 companies that would be deemed large companies, meaning the large companies that would fall in a different tax bracket under the NDP. Even some of these large companies, small companies, you also have to look at their revenue and their profitability, where they would classify that is, right? So even if they've got 50 employees, if their revenue is exceeding a certain threshold or certain things aspect that may not classify them as small business, they may end up having to pay higher taxes or different impacts. Now, there's two aspects of taxation here that come into play. These startups, they really need that retained earnings. So when a company makes money, the money left over after paying taxes goes somewhere. It either goes back into the business itself as part of expanding it, or gets paid out in towards of a dividend to shareholders. Since these are a lot of small companies, they need access to that cash. So with the NDP government, Liberal government, come in with cap and trade, or come in with CPP hikes or other policies that will drive up tax, that's actually going to reduce that after-tax income, which will then impact their ability to put money back into their business. That's not the comments you're going to hear from the NDP. They're basically trying to pander to people to vote, but not the facts that's going to drive business investment. And I'll leave most of these slides that you can go through. Now, I wanted to highlight this. How do we grow companies in Canada? Well, first we provide them access to funding. Okay, Stephen Harper's re-looked at the small business loans. He's looked at innovation funds. He's looked at basically SDTC to kind of help fund that. He's also provided seed funding to universities to help partner with them to help bring technology to market. He's kept EI and corporate taxes growth. Like EI, he's kept it growth to inflation and corporate taxes. He's not raising them. Trade and investment, we really need to have that foreign direct investment into Canada. So he's looking at export and import trade and investment deals with countries to get access to that. He's reduced red tape in terms of bringing down consolidation of filings and all that as part of governments, company, private sector, so they have to spend a lot of time in. He's done some work on the R&D program to put more emphasis that the money is getting to the people that need to use it the most, which is small business. So this is just policy statements from NDP. I talked about this before in prior stats. He's going to reduce the small business. He is emphasizing R&D, but the commitment that he's doing is like 40 million, which is a drop in the bucket. That's really not going to help it. He's basically not really dealing with the crux of the multiple issues, because typically with the NDP, they're pretty narrow in their focus on policy. They don't tend to go at all angles, so he's pretty well lacking that. Plus, he's incoherent in terms of his corporate tax policies. He's basically spun in the last month or so, changed it on a whim. Either that, he's trying to pander to votes, or he just has no clue what he's talking about in terms of the requirements. Liberal government. As I said, the SDTC was created by Ralph Goodale, and I'm going to give credit where credit is. It's an excellent program. I had chats with him on his Facebook page before I was punted because of my constant hitting Mr. Goodale with facts, but I do support this program. Trudeau supports cap and trade. He supports what Kathleen Wynne's doing in Ontario, so you'll see a cap and trade system. He's recently come out about basically expanding SDTC, but he said little on exports, so you need to be asking his questions on that. Here's the issue that you have to be very cognizant of, and this is never discussed by the NDP. You can't push green at all costs. There still has to be feasibility studies to ensure that we're doing the right mix of policy. You don't want to do what Ontario did with FIT, is push things without doing proper feasibility studies and cost checks and balances, or you'll risk what's happened that Gerald Butts, who's now involved with Trudeau, will do, is you'll bleed 300,000 good jobs out of the province related to manufacturing due to bad policies. We also need more leveraging, as I mentioned earlier, of the STTC or other programs to kind of break down things, the ability to use that precious government tax money to better leverage it. Right? We also need to break down internal trade barriers so that the provinces are working together on an integrated solution. Now, you're probably going to hear that Harper has zero interest of getting an integrated SDTC or an SDTC, a green energy policy. That's not the stumbling block. The stumbling block is these individual premiers, in most cases are left-wing radicals that are driven by green initiatives, are never going to listen to anybody that doesn't share their same beliefs. Kathleen Wynne is probably one of the biggest hypocrites you'll ever see as a premier. She likes power. She'll do anything to keep power, but she'll never deal with facts in terms of doing things, because she's an angry activist, and that's all she really cares about. I just brought in exports to kind of show you the impact. Exports in general are part of the GDP growth. They're part of the balance of payments report, and we need to basically expand exports, and part of that is how do you do that, and you need to make sure that if we're going to make green energy key, how we're going to support other aspects of exports. This kind of shows you about annual growth exports approximately about 6 billion. So I basically said if we could expand in areas like this, we could basically help clean technology going forward. is another example. You should check out his role when he was an environmental minister in Quebec. He was a failure. He signed bulk water deals. He pushed projects through without proper environmental assessments. This guy will do anything to hold on to power or push his own agenda. He's a very dangerous guy because he doesn't really see the big pictures. He's all about power, and you need to ask questions of this guy, because once you corner him and stuff, and he did this week with ISIS Mansbridge, he backpedals because he doesn't know how to respond outside a scripted response. He's not that clever to do anything other than pander for emotion. So people need to kind of call him out for who he is. Now I brought Alberta here as well because Alberta oil sands contribute to a specific fund. That fund actually basically generates money that supports green technology across. That fund should be actually expanded to better support policies across Canada. If we had provincial governments to stop bickering about money from Ottawa and actually work with Ottawa, like Brian Gallant in New Brunswick or Greg Salinger in Manitoba, then we likely would see further expansion of Canada's role in green technology. It's not just, I'm not saying Harper doesn't have, if he was given another mandate, doesn't have a role to play. He needs to break those walls down, but to come to the table, you have to get the provinces to agree to work together instead of putting up silos. The other thing I want to touch base here is Stephen Harper has introduced a lot of green retrofit programs, credits to help people retrofit their house in a green energy way. That's not discussed. There's multiple policy Harper does. The other thing too is you're going to hear about the Rivers and Lakes bill, where Harper basically passed that, changed the legislation so that the control of the waterways was falling under provincial jurisdiction, and it always has been under provincial jurisdiction. So Harper has not left the lakes unprotected. He's coordinated the efforts with the provinces, and he's delegated that to where it belongs, with the provincial area. You're never going to hear that from the NDP or the Liberal Party, because they're good at focusing on emotion and not facts. The other thing too is per capita emissions is down in Alberta. And Alberta's oil sands are not as nasty as people think. It only contributes less than 2% of the overall greenhouse gases in the world. The big producers are the ones that are generating coal, and that's China, India, and the US. Despite all these deals in terms of pushing China, India, and US against coal, there's so much money going in the background, especially with the coal industry, that's lobbied the government in terms of incentives and money, that coal isn't going away anytime soon. The other thing too is coal actually has improved its scrubbing technology, and there's clean burning processes that reduce the GHG gases down, which is not discussed either. So we need to be very careful of what you hear from the opposition parties, including what they stand in the environment. Harper hasn't been perfect, but he hasn't been the devil when it comes to the environment. He's just put it that way because he will not bend over backwards for the angry activists, people like David Suzuki, that want to push their own pro agenda. That's the issue in hand. Harper is very tough to stand up to people to what he believes in. He wants an economy growing that has multiple facets to it, and he supports many industry. He is not just about oil, as I showed you with the exports. 44% of the goods exported out of Canada are finished goods. Yet you'll never hear that from the NDP. So when you're looking at environmental policies, you have to look at all aspects of policy. It's not just water treatment, it's not just the air, it's also all aspects of supporting a sustainable business. You'll never hear the details or specifics from the NDP or Liberal about that, because again, they tend to pander for votes. Now, I just wanted to give you kind of a walkthrough on green energy and green technology, because it's an area that I really am concerned about, despite the hits I get on Facebook pages about supporting green technology that anti-environment. I'm not. I'm for the right policies and the right mix. I believe we need to be tough where we need to be tough, but we also need to be sustainable in terms of what we do in terms of moving the economy forward. Now, you have to have the right balance. I've yet to see intrinsic details from either the NDP, Liberal, how they're going to build a sustainable economy that will support existing businesses as well as look at new opportunities in fast-growing markets. But that's being said, in an election campaign, you'll never get the specific details. You'll get a bunch of quick questions and quick jabs. Harper bad, me good, and that's all you're going to ever get. Thank you so much, and have yourself a great evening.